Hi, and welcome to Season 8 of My Words, Our Journey, the podcast. I'm Monty, your host and author. Today, we begin a new journey with some old friends, Kenny, Trish, Leonard, and Sean, When Karma Kills. I hope you enjoy. Let's begin with Chapter 1. Sometime between the summer and fall of 2001. Night drives can be romantic. That is what the young man had told her at the party. A party that had started out with about 25 young people and turned into a farm field full of trucks, sports cars, motorcycles, 2 bonfires, plenty of alcohol, and whatever else young folks in the early 2000s had at their disposal. The cops would later estimate that at one time or another, during the evening, there was probably somewhere between 225 and 300 kids doing what kids do in a small town when no adults are around. Gray had promised her dad she wouldn't leave the party with anyone but her closest friend, Margie. One problem: Margie had vanished with her boyfriend of a month, Hank. She was left with his friend, Matt. Matt, the one with the now famous line, "Night drives can be romantic." Matt, the guy with the beautiful Ford Mustang. Gray was not necessarily a car person, but she did like the way it shined by the light of the moon, the way it growled when he turned the key. Maybe she was a car girl, she thought, as he pulled away from the grass onto the pavement that led away from town. The two were young, not a care in the world. Like so many on that night and thousands of nights previously, the music was loud, windows were down. Neither thought of anything past that night, past that car ride, singing loudly to Unbelievable by EMF. Gray had been around Matt since they all arrived at the party. She had seen him only drink a couple of beers, so the idea that he'd be unable to control his car wasn't even a thought. Had she known, he had taken a couple of pills from his buddy Frank right before they arrived at the party. Would she still have felt comfortable? The deer was not in the road, but Matt still freaked out and went into the left lane just before hitting the gas pedal instead of the brake. It was estimated the sports car was doing well over 100 miles an hour when it hit the maple tree. Seatbelts were not worn that night. Matt was thrown from the car, where he landed on a large rock on the side of the road, killed instantly, leaving behind a mom and dad that adored him, 2 younger sisters that looked up to their big brother. Gray was not ejected from the car, but it was older, and either it didn't have airbags, or they simply didn't work. That would be disputed by the locals after the fact. Either way, Gray was trapped in what was nothing that resembled a vehicle after it hit the tree. She was bleeding from her head, face, chest, and it appeared to the first responders there was a deep cut that ran across the length of her neck that had soaked her t-shirt. It took nearly 40 minutes to remove her from the wreckage once authorities were on scene. Sadly, she and Matt had been there for nearly an hour before that, because no one had driven down the secluded road until an overnight worker at one of the local plants was headed in for their shift. When she was finally removed and placed in the ambulance, the look on everyone's face said it all. They were too late. Before they could get ready to roll, they had lost her pulse twice. The 2 young EMTs in the back were doing their best, but all their training had not prepared them for this. The driver, Justin, was yelling for them to strap her in so that they could move. Lenny and Callie didn't listen. They were trying to keep her alive. The cops watched as they lost her and then revived her, each wondering how many times this young body could handle the stress. When they finally sped off, the officers took their pictures, measurements, and waited for the coroner to arrive for Matt. David, Smitty, and Kenny were the only 3 officers on duty that night in a small town. None had any experience with something like this. When they were watching the wrecker pulling the jumbled mess onto the flatbed, David called his friend Lenny to see how the girl was doing. He was only on the phone for a couple of minutes. When he was done, he told his partners what he had learned. The young girl was Milt Davis's daughter. She had fought hard, but they had lost her pulse pulling into the ER. The trio knew Mr. Davis from the local restaurant he had run for years. He had the best hamburger steak in the county. They had decided it would be best if someone they knew broke the news. Better to hear it from people you know, they thought. If you asked them later which one had the idea, no one would admit to it. Milt was exactly what you'd envision if you were asked to think about the perfect Southern gentleman. He would hold the door open for everyone. He was always ready to volunteer for anything that needed to be done around the community or the church. He never said a bad word about anyone or anything. He had loved only one woman, Carrie, whom he had met when they were in the 6th grade. They married after high school. He went into the service, and when he came out, he worked part-time, 2 jobs, went to school for business, and then opened the diner with a loan from the local small-town bank. Carrie had died a few years ago after the restaurant opened and their baby was very young. Gray was the center of their universe, named after an imaginary friend Carrie had grown up with, a friend that had gotten her through some tough times over the years. He had a hard time saying no to Gray. He tried when she was younger, then as a teen, but he didn't want to disappoint her. He had no strength to fight. He just wanted her happy. So many times, against his better judgment, he would watch her do things he didn't approve of, like going to late-night parties. When the knock came at the front door, he was waiting up for his daughter and assumed she had forgotten her key, like she had so many times before. This time, however, she had not forgotten her keys. 3 uniformed officers stood at his door. They had never made a death announcement before, stumbled through it, badly. And then, when they were done, they watched as the man they knew since they were young fell backwards of an apparent heart attack. Chapter 2, A Miracle. It was almost 2 months to the day when Gray woke from her coma. It was considered by many to be a miracle. The small-town hospital had not been able to pull the plug at any point during those 2 months. Volunteers would watch over her. Monies were given to the hospital to lighten the financial burden, and when the news spread quickly through the community, you could hear and feel the excitement and relief of a community that needed good news. Times were tough. The local economy was in decline. Many had struggled to make ends meet, and when they had an opportunity to rejoice, they accepted it wholeheartedly. The question was asked as soon as she opened her eyes. It was easy to ignore at first because of the chaos and frenzy that was a person coming out of a coma after a long time. But, in time, the young girl realized she was being ignored because no one wanted to answer her question. Where was her father? The EMT, Lenny, told his friends that they had lost her once they entered the ER parking lot. What no one did was call him back to let him know she had come back to life yet again, and this time had made it into the hospital where doctors would keep her from dying. It was not until the next morning that the trio were informed of the news, which, on one hand, was great, but on the other hand, well. Like in most small towns, everyone wanted to know everyone else's business, and while most of the time it was difficult to keep a secret, in this case, there were only a few that knew the truth about what really happened at the Davis house. It had been determined it'd be better for everyone if it was never spoken of again. It was a shame that the car accident and his heart attack happened during the same time period, but many considered it a blessing that poor Milt never had to know what happened to his precious daughter. 2 of the cops washed the truth away with liquor, while the third put all he had into being a better cop, a better person. Gray, when she was finally told that her father had passed, had to be sedated 2 different times during the first 48 hours that followed. Counselors and therapists were paraded in and out of her room with seemingly no effect. She would only eat 1 small meal a day, only drink water with her medicine that she had to almost be forced to take 3 times a day. When she was deemed okay to leave the hospital, she was moved to a home for wayward women, because honestly, the town didn't know what to do with her. She was too young to be alone, too old for the average family to want to adopt, and no relatives were found that were willing to help. Her family home was sold, and after medical expenses and paying off a couple of her father's debts, Gray was left with a little over $50,000. There was also a life insurance policy worth $150,000, and when the restaurant was sold, after all expenses and liabilities were paid, there would be another $75,000. Gray would be able to start a new life when she turned 18, maybe go to college, study whatever interested her, make a difference in the world. Chapter 3, Present Day. Kenny was stepping out of the shower. He was still in awe of his view of the city he had from his condo. Charlotte was like any other big city. There was good and bad, and everything in between. But the city had been good for him, and Sean, and he tried only to focus on the positive. The view across the city skyline was something to behold. It was 9 p.m., so the city was lit up and alive. Kenny was too, if he had to be honest. He was going on a date. A special date, if he didn't lose his nerve. It had been 11 months since the whole Wilmington fiasco with Leonard. Kenny and Trish had been dating for 8 of those months, long distance. Renee decided she wasn't interested in Kenny's way of life, and within 2 months, she had married a twice divorced plastic surgeon she met on a website and moved to Colorado. The stress and strain of Wilmington had been too much. The relationship couldn't handle it. Kenny had thought of calling Trish almost immediately, but he decided he needed a little time to process the relationship he had just come out of. It had actually been Trish that had reached out through social media, just a simple hi, that, by the way, set his heart on fire. Tonight, he'd be picking her up from the airport. Then he had reservations at the Capitol Grill for a late dinner. He had taken a few days off so he could really show Trish all the city had to offer. He was trying to build up the courage to ask her to move to the city with him. It was not a foregone conclusion that she would say yes, and the thought of messing up what they currently had overwhelmed him. Her career had taken off in recent months. She seemed happy, and she loved the water. That's why, during her visit, they'd be spending the day cruising Mountain Island Lake, where he had rented a pontoon boat for the day. It wasn't the ocean, but it was beautiful, and only minutes outside of the city. They could actually move to the lake if she wanted, he thought as he grabbed his keys. Kenny was making his way onto Wilkinson Boulevard when his phone began to vibrate. He did not recognize the number, but he had a few minutes until he got to the airport, so he swiped right. After saying hello, there was nothing but static on the sedan speakers. Again, hello, this time a little louder. Finally, an unfamiliar voice, nervous, said, Is this Kenny Costco? The Kenny C that worked the Gray Davis accident years ago? Kenny, for a moment, released the wheel as he ran his hands through his hair. He had not heard that name in many years, and was not prepared for it now. The person on the end of the line did not speak again until Kenny said a simple, Yes? Can I ask what's this in reference to? Kenny, this is Lenny Combs. I was in the ambulance that night. I think we have a problem. Chapter 4. Moving Through. Winter, 2001. Grace sat on the edge of her bed. Well, the bed she was assigned to at the women's shelter. She was blessed to have a single room to herself. The package had been delivered the previous afternoon. Now it sat in the silence, Grace staring at it, not sure why she was so leery of unwrapping a Christmas paper, other than the fact she knew no one that would be sending her anything. Any relatives she may still have had long disowned her and her father. When her mother had passed away, her dad didn't handle it well. He just couldn't be around people, couldn't talk to them, either side of the family, and after numerous tries, they had all eventually given up. She didn't blame them. She wouldn't have tried as hard as they had. But she also understood how he felt. She had felt the same way. It had taken her a long time to start beginning to socialize again, and while she was trying to fit in with her peers, her dad would volunteer and help others wherever he could. His reward for just trying to be the best he could was to die of a heart attack at age 55. That she fought with every day. He had appeared so healthy and had just been to the doctors for a physical only a few weeks before his death. He didn't smoke, rarely drank, and she made sure he ate well. She had gone through all the stages. The one she entered and never left was hate. She hated whatever fate had taken her parents and left her alone in the world. The package seemed to move closer to her as she refocused on the present. Slowly unwrapping the gift was about the size of a shoebox. Only took a moment. Then, there in front of her, was a music box. When opened, a lovely dancer began to spin, with an almost familiar tune softly playing in the background. Inside, a note which read, I truly hope this gift finds you well. I know this time of year must be hard on you. I truly am sorry for the way your life has turned out. If I could go back and change things, I most certainly would. But even though that night haunts me daily, I can think of no way to make things right. Still, I want you to know there is someone cheering for you, and I only wish you the best going forward. Sent with thoughts and prayers. The letter had been read twice, The packaging and music box examined for any clue of the sender. Nothing. She fell asleep that night, holding an article about her accident and her father's death. Chapter 5. Present Day. GVD. Trish looked as beautiful as ever as she smiled coming through the gate. Kenny did his best to return the expression. He was truly happy to see her, but the call had certainly put a damper on things. As they embraced, he thought about the words the man had nervously spoken. "I think we have a problem." They held hands as they walked towards the luggage pickup. It felt good, right. But was he putting her in danger? Was there a name from his past stalking him at this very moment? The information had been minimal and vague at best, but it was enough to cause concern. Trish had excused herself and headed to the restroom. Kenny stayed with the luggage and thought about what he had heard and how he was going to handle the situation based on what he knew. He decided he'd call the authorities first thing in the morning, get more information, and go from there. He also decided he would not let the news affect his evening. That could not be said for Lenny. Ever since he learned Justin Tucker had been found dead, he had been freaking out. He had only visited his old friend in Kentucky the previous month. While there, he had made friends with one of Justin's co-workers, one Vinny Staple. It was Vinny that had broken the news to Lenny. He didn't have all the details, but there was one thing that set Lenny off on his tangent. When telling him about the way the body had been found, he told Lenny a knife had been plunged into Justin's heart, and a bloody note was on the tip of the knife. It simply said, "I found my why. You have lived your lives without consequence. That will change." And it was signed, 3 simple letters, GVD. It had taken Lenny less than 5 minutes to find what he was looking for after hanging up the phone. It was an old newspaper clipping, an article about Gray Vivian Davis, GVD. He had taken the time to contact each person he could remember being involved in the case that night. Some he was waiting on callbacks from. He was just hoping he was wrong. But he didn't know how he could be. Kenny had seemed worried, but also distracted. Lenny knew he was a bigwig at some firm in North Carolina, and he may have resources that could help them, he hoped. Until then, he made the decision to leave town. He had been born and raised in North Charleston, lived in his parents' house that they had built when they were newlyweds, still worked at the same hospital. He wouldn't be hard to find. He didn't know why Justin would be first. If he was, maybe others had been killed and not discovered yet. Either way, he was leaving. Lenny tossed his duffel bag in the back seat and then reread the text he had sent his supervisor at work. He hated to lie to her. She'd always treated him fairly, but it was either blame his absence on COVID or a crazy stalker is trying to kill me because of something that happened a long time ago, something I really wasn't even a part of. He never finished his thought. He heard the footfalls, but did not get completely turned around before he took a direct kick in the head. It sent him back, hitting the small SUV, then the pavement. He could tell his nose was broken, and blood began to run down his face. There was no time to react. The figure stood directly above him. The lighting wasn't great, but he was sure who it was. Only, she'd grown up and looked nothing like the pictures in the old newspaper articles. He tried to slip through her legs, wanting to get away, too injured to fight. The kick had done what it was meant to do. He was dazed, disoriented. Still, he made his move. With all his strength, Lenny pushed his way away from the vehicle and from underneath his attacker. It did no good. She was quick, like a cat quick, and was back on him. This time he saw the blade, sharp with a reflection in the streetlight, showing its length and serrated edges. No words were spoken between the assailant and the victim. They both knew what brought them to this moment. Lenny closed his eyes. There was no prayer or thoughts of happier times, just the resolution that his time was done. The tip found its intended target, and he died instantly. Neighbors would later say they never saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. And that seems like a good stopping point for today. Thank you so much for joining this journey. I hope you enjoyed episode 1. Have a great day.